Hey guys, tonight we travel far, far away to the windswept heights of the Tibetan plateau, a land often called the roof of the world. You close your eyes and picture the thin, shimmering air where each breath feels like it has been pulled straight from the heavens. The mountains stretch in all directions, white caps glowing faintly under a quiet moon. At this altitude, the earth seems to bend toward the stars, and the people who live here have always believed that they walk closer to the gods than anyone else. So take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you don't mind, I'd love for you to share your location and the time where you are right now. I'm always curious where these stories reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tread across the high grasslands where the wind rushes so steadily that prayer flags strung between wooden poles never fall still. Yaks graze nearby, shaggy and broad, perfectly suited to the chill that seeps into bones unused to this altitude. The landscape itself seems to conspire in shaping the destiny of those who dwell here. Crops are hard to raise, winters are brutal, yet from this harsh ground rises one of the most formidable powers of its age, the Tibetan Empire. You can almost hear the muffled drum beats echoing across valleys, carried on the wind like heartbeats of a nation that is only beginning to imagine itself. The 7th century is just taking shape. Across the plateau, many clans and tribes move with their herds, each loyal to its own chieftain, each wary of its rivals. Yet whispers of something greater drift through markets where barley is traded for salt, or where wool passes into foreign hands along mountain passes. A single leader is beginning to unite them, binding feuds into loyalty. His name is Songtsen Gampo, though for now you only sense the tremors of his rise. Historians still argue whether geography itself determined Tibet's expansionist spirit, or whether it was the hunger of kings. What is certain is that survival at such heights bred resilience, and resilience became ambition. While the Tang dynasty in China looked west with dreams of Silk Road, wealth, Tibet turned eastward, with eyes sharpened by the glint of snow and steel. It is in these first moments, as tribes become subjects and scattered herders become citizens, that you feel the empire begin to stir. Beneath your feet lies a land riddled with secrets. You stumble on ancient burial mounds, their stones half buried in frost, where skeletons of horses have been laid beside warriors. Archaeologists uncover bronze mirrors from distant lands, hinting that even before empire trade reached these lonely ridges. And among the relics are signs of ritual sacrifice, though whether to honor ancestors or to ensure fertile grazing lands, no one is entirely sure. You brush the dust from such mysteries and realize this was never a people cut off from the world. The plateau itself feels alive. Clouds crawl quickly across the sky, shadows dragging like curtains over ridges. At night, when the cold deepens, the stars appear sharp and piercing, as if you could reach out and pluck them like fruit. The people who live here imagine spirits in every peak and guardian deities in every river. To walk this land is to accept that you are never alone, always watched, always guided, or perhaps judged. This sense of cosmic closeness becomes a heartbeat in the culture, merging with the empire's hunger for power. In distant valleys you hear the clang of iron tools shaping stones into fortresses. Across mountain trails, messages are carried by swift riders, each one a thread tying together what had once been scattered tribes. A new sense of belonging begins to whisper among them. For the first time, people call themselves subjects of a kingdom rather than a clan. And as this unity strengthens, you feel an inevitable pull outward, an empire stretching its limbs. You pause to imagine the tension this creates. To the east lies Tang China, prosperous, organized, and proud. The Tang emperors watch their borders, carefully unwilling to concede strength to a neighbor rising from the clouds. Already you sense the clash to come. Yet for now the air is heavy with possibility, the kind that precedes storms. A curious detail lingers in your thoughts early. Tibetan kings were said to descend from the heavens on ropes of light tethered to the sky like kites. Some chronicles describe them as semi-divine, able to return to the heavens when their time ended. Whether these are legends spun by later monks or echoes of old shamanic belief, no one can say with certainty. Still, it reveals how Tibetans saw their rulers not just men, but figures entwined with the very cosmos. You keep walking across the plateau, every crunch of frost beneath your boots a reminder of how fragile life here can be, and how extraordinary it is that an empire should rise in such a place. Ahead, the path narrows between cliffs, and you feel as though history itself is funneling you toward the next stage of the journey. What begins as a gathering of tribes will soon roar into wars that shake the capitals of the greatest dynasty in the world. Songtsen Gampo is still young when you first see him, seated high upon a throne of rough-hewn wood, draped in furs, against the mountain cold. His eyes, however, are not young. They burn with an intensity that makes courtiers lower their gaze. You stand among a crowd of tribal chiefs, the air thick with the scent of yak butter lamps, and you sense that something greater than a council is unfolding. This is the moment when scattered clans become a kingdom, and one man begins to imagine stretching his power beyond the horizons of the plateau. You hear the story told in whispers how Songtsen Gampo inherited a patchwork of tribes from his father Namri Songtsen, whose sudden death left the throne vulnerable. Historians still argue whether Namri was murdered by rivals or simply fell to illness, but either way, it was a dangerous time. Yet instead of collapsing, the young heir managed to rally warriors and seize power. In a world where loyalty was fragile and betrayal common, his skill was not just in war, but in vision. He saw a future that went beyond survival. Outside the wooden hall, trumpets carved from horns echo across the valley, announcing decrees that reshaped the land. Tribes are bound together into provinces, their leaders compelled to submit, some by persuasion, others by the threat of steel. Songtsen Gampo begins building Lhasa as a true capital, a place where power radiates outward like ripples in a mountain lake. You walk its muddy streets in your imagination, watching workers raise walls of stone and wood, and sense the hum of a city just beginning to imagine its destiny. To the east, however, lies Tang China, a colossus of wealth, culture, and armies vast enough to fill the valleys like waves. The Tang emperors consider themselves heirs to the mandate of heaven, destined to bring order to all under the sky. For a king on the plateau, it is both an opportunity and a danger. Songtsen Gampo studies their system, their art, their books, and perhaps most importantly, their marriages. It is here that a curious detail surfaces. Tibetan legend tells that Songtsen Gampo had multiple wives, among them Princess Brikuti of Nepal and Princess Wencheng of Tang China. Some scholars believe these stories reflect real diplomatic marriages. Others argue they were later inventions to strengthen Tibet's ties to Buddhism and China. Still, the image lingers in the imagination. You see the young ruler gazing across snow-covered mountains, plotting not just battles, but bonds. You pause to consider the terrain itself. Every path into China crosses daunting passes where snow can bury an army in silence. Yet every path is also a gate, and Songtsen Gampo's gaze seems always to rest on those gates. The Tang dynasty may see Tibet as a remote frontier, but Tibet sees China as the nearest rival and richest prize. Walking along the Lhasa River, you hear the clang of smiths forging weapons, the bark of commanders drilling men into organized units. Warriors who once fought as tribal raiders now ride in formation spears, glinting like rows of icicles in the sun. The empire is learning discipline. It is as though the thin mountain air itself is sharpening them into something more dangerous than their neighbors expect. Songtsen Gampo also turns inward, commissioning the construction of temples and introducing written laws often said to be influenced by foreign systems. A fragment of an old chronicle describes how the king sought to model administration after the sophisticated bureaucracy of China, though adapted to Tibetan needs. Whether this is exaggeration or truth, the effect is clear. Tibet is no longer just a scattering of pastoral clans, but a centralized force. Historians still argue whether Songtsen Gampo's ambitions were truly imperial or simply defensive. Did he dream of conquest, or only wish to secure his borders against Tang expansion? In the soft glow of flickering butter lamps, it is impossible to know. But as you listen to the murmurs of courtiers and the sharp bark of military orders outside, you sense the future is leaning toward conflict. A more mystical note colors his story as well. Some Tibetan traditions describe Songtsen Gampo as a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. How curious that a man remembered for war might also be remembered as an emanation of mercy. Perhaps this duality reveals the essence of empire itself, swords in one hand, prayers in the other. You walk through the growing streets of Lhasa, past new fortresses rising like teeth from the earth, and you know these stones will one day face armies far larger than their builders could imagine. The air hums with change, and as night falls, the mountains seem to lean closer, listening. The young king's vision is reaching eastward, and you can feel the weight of his eyes on Tang China. The night is cool when the caravan arrives from the east, its bells jingling softly as camels kneel in the dust of Lhasa's courtyard. From among the attendants steps a figure wrapped in silk, finer than anything you have seen on the plateau. She is Princess Wencheng of Tang China, sent across treacherous mountains to bind Tibet and China in a fragile web of marriage. You stand among the crowd that has gathered to glimpse her, sensing both curiosity and suspicion in the air. For Tibetans, this union promises recognition and legitimacy. For the Tang court, it is meant as a tool of peace, though peace on such borders rarely lasts. The wedding procession glows with firelight. Musicians play drums that echo against the mountains, while dancers swirl in heavy brocade. You hear a voice beside you whisper that this princess brings not only silks and jewels, but also texts, astrological charts, and images of the Buddha. Legends claim she introduced barley beer and techniques of weaving, though historians still argue whether these gifts were real or symbolic. What is certain is that her arrival represents an exchange of cultures as well as politics. Inside the royal hall, Songtsen Gampo sits tall, his presence commanding, though his eyes soften when they rest on his new bride. His court watches closely, reading every gesture for signs of strength or weakness. Alongside Wencheng sits another consort, Princess Brikuti from Nepal, who is said to have already brought Buddhist icons and influence. Between them, Tibet's spiritual and political horizons expand for Nepal, and China are two great powers whose daughters now share the Tibetan throne. You drift with the festivities into the night, but even in celebration, you feel an undercurrent of tension. Alliances sealed by marriage are fragile things, as likely to unravel as to hold. In Chang'an, Tang ministers murmur that giving a princess to the Tibetans is a humiliation, while Tibetan chiefs wonder if it means submission. Yet the moment feels weighty, as though a door has opened between empires. beyond the palace temples rise. Songtsen Gampo orders the construction of Jokhang and Ramoche, two of Tibet's most sacred sanctuaries said to house statues carried by his queens. One of these, the Jowo Shakyamuni image, becomes the heart of Tibetan Buddhism, still revered to this day. The faint smell of incense clings to the air as monks chant in low voices, their syllables curling upward like smoke to the rafters. Here you glimpse how war and faith intertwine, politics securing the union, religion deepening its meaning. A curious tidbit clings to the story of the marriage. Some chronicles suggest that when Songtsen Gampo first proposed to Tang, his envoys were dismissed with disdain. Only after a show of Tibetan strength, perhaps even raids into Chinese territory, did the Tang court reconsider. Historians debate this sequence, whether it was pressure or diplomacy that secured the princess's hand. What remains clear is that marriage was as much a weapon as any sword. You imagine the princess adapting to life in the high mountains, her silk soon lined with fur against the cold, her meals filled with butter tea and barley bread instead of the delicacies of Chang'an. Perhaps she longed for the blossoming gardens of her homeland, or perhaps she embraced her role, understanding that her presence was a bridge between two worlds. Either way, her name would echo through centuries of Tibetan legend, remembered not just as a wife but as a bearer of faith. For a time, peace holds. Caravans move more freely, envoys exchange gifts, and Tibet's court gleams with foreign influence. Yet beneath the surface rivalry remains. Both empires are expanding their ambitions, pressing against the same territories. You feel it like a pressure in the air before a storm, the knowledge that this union is only a pause, not an ending. Walking through the palace, you notice wall paintings, images of dancers, warriors, and deities painted in vivid colors. Some historians suggest that artistic styles introduced during Wencheng's time carried the imprint of Tang China, blending with local traditions to shape Tibetan art. Whether or not that influence was direct, you see it as a symbol. Tibet was absorbing the world while asserting its own power. As dawn creeps over the snowy peaks, the torches of the wedding night sputter out, leaving the city quiet. You feel the stillness that follows celebration, heavy with questions. Will the marriage bring stability, or will it prove only another step toward conflict? The alliance glimmers like morning frost, beautiful but fragile, destined to melt as the sun of ambition rises. The mountains close in around you, their jagged ridges like walls of stone, and ahead looms a fortress perched high upon a crag. You walk the winding path toward it, the air thinning with each step, until you reach gates reinforced with timber and iron. These are the strongholds of the Tibetan Empire bastions, built to watch the passes and guard the high plateau. From their towers, soldiers scan the valleys, eyes narrowed against the glare of snow alert for any glint of steel that might signal Tang patrols on the move. Inside the courtyards echo with the clash of practice swords and the stamping of horses. You watch as men in thick woolen cloaks drill with bows and spears their yaks grazing beyond the walls. Some historians suggest that Tibet's fortifications drew inspiration from Chinese military architecture, though adapted to the harsher climate of the plateau. Others argue they were entirely indigenous, rooted in ancient traditions of clan warfare. What is clear is that stone and discipline together became the armor of a rising empire. At night, these fortresses are cold and drafty, the wind howling through arrow slits like the cries of restless spirit. Yet the garrisons endure, warming themselves by yak dung fires, telling tales of raids and battles. One soldier murmurs of a curious detail. Sometimes watchmen swear they see phantom riders galloping across the moonlit snowfields, omens of war or blessings from mountain gods. Whether hallucinations from the thin air or genuine belief, such visions shape the way these warriors steel themselves for combat. You stand on the battlements looking outward. To the east, the land dips into rolling hills that eventually lead toward China's fertile valleys. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Tang garrisons keep their own watch-building walls and forts in answer to Tibet's. The frontier bristles with suspicion, each empire glaring at the other through stone towers and mountain passes. Envoys travel between them carrying letters sealed in wax words of peace, spoken with carefully measured courtesy. Yet even as gifts are exchanged, whispers circulate that caravans may be carrying more than silk, perhaps spies, perhaps maps of hidden passes. You realize that in this high frontier, war is never far away. The walls themselves seem to know it, their stones absorbing the tension like frost in the cracks. Songtsen Gampo orders more of these fortresses built, securing the plateau's edges. Some rise in valleys where rivers cut through the mountains, others guard narrow trails that only a handful of men can pass at once. From above they seem like teeth biting into the land, holding it tight against foreign advance. Walking through their courtyards, you hear the low chanting of monks who bless the garrisons, mixing prayers with military readiness. The fusion of faith and war is everywhere, each reinforcing the other. Historians still argue whether these constructions were primarily defensive or whether they reveal an empire preparing for expansion. Some say the Tibetan kings sought simply to protect their fragile unity against Tang encroachment. Others believe they were sharpening their blades for inevitable conquest. Looking out from the walls, it is hard not to feel that both answers might be true at once. In the distance, smoke curls upward from a Tang outpost, a faint smudge against the sky. You can almost imagine their watchmen staring back at you, wondering if tonight will bring a raid, a treaty, or silence. This eerie standoff, repeated across hundreds of miles, becomes the rhythm of frontier life, tension punctuated by skirmishes, suspicion laced with diplomacy. A more curious story lingers in the chronicles. It is said that in some forts, Tibetan soldiers painted protective symbols on their shields, calling on mountain deities to blind their enemies. These symbols, often spirals or flames, remain carved in stones, even centuries later, reminders that faith was as much a weapon as steel. You leave the fortress as night settles. The walls glow faintly in moonlight, casting long shadows down the slopes. Inside, the soldiers huddle close to fires, sharpening their blades, murmuring prayers to unseen guardians. Outside, the wind scours the plateau, carrying the scent of snow and the quiet promise that war is drawing nearer. The silence of the plateau shatters one morning with the thud of hooves. A cloud of snow rises where Tibetan riders thunder across a ridge, their cloaks streaming like banners. You trail after them, breathless in the thin air, until you see dust rising in the distance, another force Tang patrols pushing west along the frontier. The two groups converge in a narrow valley, steel flashing briefly before the sound reaches you, the harsh clash of iron on iron, the sharp cries of men and horses. Border skirmishes have begun. The scene is chaotic, yet strangely disciplined. Tibetan horsemen circle in loose formations, loosing arrows while galloping at breakneck speed. The Tang troops, trained in their empire's long traditions of warfare, hold steady ranks with shields and spears. Neither side seeks annihilation. Instead, they test each other, probing weaknesses, learning the terrain. It is war in miniature, though you feel its significance as something far greater, like sparks before a wildfire. You crouch behind a boulder, watching as a Tibetan rider looses a shaft that thuds into a Tang officer's shield. The two sides pull back after a brief clash, vanishing into the folds of the mountains as quickly as they appeared. Yet the valley remains haunted by the skirmish, trampled snow, broken arrows, a single helmet left glinting under the sun. These encounters, small as they seem, will accumulate like stones stacked into a wall, each one laying the foundation for greater wars to come. Historians still argue whether these early fights were sparked by Tibetan raids or Tang encroachment. Some records describe Tibetans harassing Chinese garrisons testing their defenses, while others insist Tang forces crossed into Tibetan pastures first. The truth is buried beneath layers of pride and propaganda, but as you stand in that valley, you sense the answer may lie in both two expanding empires pressing against the same fragile frontier. Back at the fortress, stories of the clash spread quickly. Soldiers lean close to fires, recounting how many Tang men fell, how swiftly the Tibetans melted back into the high passes. A curious tale emerges that the spirits of the mountains appeared as blinding snowstorms shielding Tibet's retreat. Some dismiss it as exaggeration, yet you feel the weight of belief here. In a land where nature itself is both ally and enemy, such tales shape courage as much as swords. Patrol routes become tense, every rider expecting to stumble upon enemies. You travel with one such band of scouts, the cold biting through your cloak. Their eyes scan constantly, pausing at every ridgeline. When a hawk circles overhead, one soldier mutters that it is an omen, whether of victory or death he does not say. In the stillness you realize how thin the line is between peace and war in this land. The political consequences ripple outward. In Lhasa, advisors debate how far to push these raids. Some counsel restraint, fearing that full-scale conflict with Tang China could overextend the young empire. Others whisper of opportunity of proving Tibetan strength before Chinese armies march in force. You sense Songtsen Gampo weighing these arguments, the flicker of ambition in his gaze. He has already bound his kingdom together with marriage and law. Now he tests its steel. Meanwhile, in Chang'an, news of these border clashes troubles the imperial court. Ministers debate whether to dismiss Tibet as a nuisance or treat it as a serious threat. Some insist the Tang should focus on the riches of Central Asia. Others warn that ignoring Tibet will invite disaster. You imagine the tension in those candlelit halls, the emperor listening in silence as his advisors quarrel, and so the skirmishes continue. One day it is a raid on a supply caravan, another a sudden clash at a mountain pass. None decides the war, yet each deepens mistrust. The plateau, once a remote barrier, has become a battleground in miniature. As dusk settles, you sit on a ridge overlooking the valley where the first clash took place. The snow has covered most of the scars, though here and there a broken spear still juts out stubborn against the wind. The silence feels heavier now, as though the land itself knows that more blood will soon be shed upon it. The plains stretch out before you, windswept and vast, with tall grasses bending in waves beneath a pale sun. This is Dafeichuan, a place whose name will soon echo in chronicles as the site of a clash that reshaped the balance of power between Tibet and Tang China. You tighten your cloak against the chill and watch as dust rises on the horizon, first in thin plumes, then in rolling clouds. Two armies are approaching, each vast enough to darken the land. The Tibetan host arrives, first horsemen spreading across the plain in loose, flexible ranks. Their banners snap in the wind, dyed with symbols of flame and spiral, invoking the guardians of mountain and sky. Riders hold long spears and composite bows, their yaks and horses laden with supplies. You can sense their confidence honed by countless skirmishes in the high passes. They know how to vanish into snow, how to strike swiftly, how to make the mountains themselves fight on their side. From the east comes the Tang army, armored troops in tight formations, drums booming like thunder to keep their steps in unison. Their banners bear the imperial dragon, gold and crimson shimmering in the light. Cavalry rides along the flanks, armored horses gleaming, while infantry lines stretch so far you cannot see their end. This is not a patrol, not a border raid. This is a declaration. When the two sides meet, the earth trembles. Tibetan horsemen dart forward, loosing arrows in clouds that hiss through the air like hail. Tang soldiers raise shields, arrows clattering against lacquered wood, then push ahead with spear walls. The clash is deafening, metal striking metal, men shouting, horses screaming. Dust swirls, mingling with the smell of sweat and blood. You move with the tide of battle pulled into the chaos. Tibetan cavalry breaks through a flank, scattering Tang soldiers who stumble in the tall grass. Trumpets sound, signaling a counterattack, and the Tang surge forward, driving deep into the Tibetan line. For a moment, the battle seems poised in balance. Then the plains erupt with movement. Tibetan reserves charge in waves, surrounding and overwhelming the Tang. Historians still argue over the scale of the defeat. Some chronicles describe it as catastrophic, a humiliation that sent shockwaves through Chang'an. Others suggest the loss was serious, but not devastating, exaggerated by Tibetan memory. What is certain is that Tibet emerged emboldened, its riders proving they could shatter even the might of Tang armies in open field. A curious tale emerges from the battlefield. Some Tibetans claim that before the clash began, shamans performed rituals, scattering white barley flour across the plain to confuse enemy spirits. After the victory, warriors swore that the flour still shimmered faintly on the grass, mingling with the dust of battle. Whether superstition or truth, it reveals how war here was as much spiritual as physical. As you wander across the aftermath, the air hangs heavy with silence. Broken spears jut from the ground, shields lie half buried in the grass, and the bodies of horses stretch across the plain. Ravens circle overhead, their cries sharp and eerie. You kneel and touch the trampled earth, feeling the weight of history pressing down. Back in Lhasa, news of the victory spreads like wildfire. Drums beat in celebration, butter lamps blaze in temples, and monks chant prayers of thanks. Songtsen Gampo's name resounds as a conqueror, as well as a king, his people lifting him higher in both reverence and fear. Across the plateau, tribes bow to his authority more firmly, realizing that Tibet is no longer a fragile alliance, but a force that can defeat China itself. In Chang'an, however, the mood is grim. Ministers gather in tense silence, their voices rising in bitter debate. Should the empire strike back with greater force? Should they seek a truce? Some records suggest the emperor grew restless, walking his halls at night, troubled by the idea that the plateau, once dismissed as remote, had delivered such a sting. Night falls again over Defichuan. The grasses whisper in the wind, hiding the scars of battle, yet the memory lingers. You feel it in the ground beneath your feet, a shift subtle but certain, as though the balance of two empires has tilted slightly westward. Tibet has drawn blood, and the world has begun to take notice. Chang'an does not sleep well after news from the west. You pass beneath the shadow of its vermilion gates at dusk, where the city wall swallows the last light, and the watch drums begin their steady heartbeat. Lanterns bloom one by one along the avenues, their mica panes turning flame into soft gold. You walk straight into the capital's nervous glow, where merchants shut stalls early and messengers ride hard through the gate towers, dust ghosting their cloaks. Word of the defeat at Defichuan has arrived like a winter draft under a door, uninvited, chilling, and impossible to ignore. Within the palace precinct, the avenues broaden into order and geometry, Chang'an's confident grid trying to hold back the creeping sense of uncertainty. You hear the clack of wooden clappers as the night patrol makes its rounds, and you follow the sound toward the outer halls where ministers gather. The court is already thick with arguments. Some call for new levies, others for a measured truce. A few with carefully lowered voices wonder whether the plateau is worth its salt and wool. Yet the map on the wall tells a harsher truth. The routes that arc around the Taklamakan desert, Those veins that bring jade spices and silk run perilously close to Tibetan reach. Above the murmuring ministers, the imperial presence weighs on every sentence. Emperor Gaozong rules in name, but you can feel the gravity of Empress Wu's mind tightening the room. She sits very still, eyes taking in the factions before they can sort themselves into winners and losers. Somewhere deep in the palace, the great clepsydra ticks in water drops time itself, measured into bowls, and you sense how the court counts, chances the same way drop by drop. A minister clears his throat and cites the fact that cannot be massaged away in 670 Tang forces under the famed General Shui Rengui met the Tibetans near the Dafei River and came home with nothing but broken ranks and bitter lessons. The statement hangs like frost in the air. Even the scribes pause. You drift along the edges of the debate, listening. A hawkish official argues that the 4 garrisons of Angsi, Kucha, Karashar, Kashgar, Khotan must be reinforced at once, else Tibet will pry the Tarim's doors off their hinges. Another warns that the treasury, already strained by campaigns against steppe powers, cannot endure another full-scale Western war. A third suggests turning to the Uyghurs for cavalry support. Alliances are the currency of survival. In the background, the ritual hush of court etiquette barely conceals the crackle of fear. Historians still argue whether the reports from Defeichuan were magnified by political rivals to weaken the general's standing, or whether the defeat truly threatened Tang control across Central Asia. Past the court, Chang'an's life tries to proceed as usual. In the eastern market, tea houses breathe out steam and rumour. Storytellers adjust their tales to fit the new mood, swapping triumphal epics for cautionary ones. You sip something warm and bitter and listen to a trader mutter that caravans have begun carrying fewer bolts of silk and more bundles of leather shields just in case. A curious tidbit drifts your way. The night watch at the city wall now stamps ash into the mortar to show each morning where the stones were disturbed in the dark, a small ritual of certainty in a season of doubt. Whether the practice is new or simply noticed now that fear sharpens the eyes, you cannot say, but it feels like a charm against the unknown. Across the city, monasteries hum with low chanting, while in the academies, scholars sketch neat characters that say everything except how to calm an empire's pulse. You wander into a courtyard where students debate the classics under a ginkgo tree, their voices floating like leaves. One quotes a line about the mandate of heaven: if virtue falters, omens multiply. He gestures at the west and lets the sentence trail off. Virtue omens the far plateau. These are not abstractions tonight. They are directions on a map and requisitions for horses. In the barracks, the air smells of oil and iron. Armourers re-rivet lamellae, testing each thong with a tug. A veteran shows a younger man how to wrap a bowstring in damp cloth to keep it from fraying in mountain air. The talk here is stripped of poetry. They speak of ration weights of spare hooves for pack animals, of what snow does to feet and what altitude does to lungs. A captain traces a route in spilled grain on the Table River Pass fort, then blows the grain aside with a frown. The plateau refuses to be tamed by lines. The court reforms its arguments by midnight and sends them to the throne, engraved in careful calligraphy. One faction proposes a punitive column to restore face and frighten Tibetan commanders back behind their ridges. Another faction suggests a letter thick with compliments and thinly veiled threats, asking for the return of seized towns near the Dafei Valley. Between these poles lies a narrow bridge withdrawal from the most exposed posts while reinforcing the ones that guard the oases like beads on a string. You can almost hear the abacus beads clacking supplies, stipends, arrows, grain, every bead a soldier's breath. You step outside for air and find Chang'an vast and hushed. The city's north-south axis draws your eye toward the dark bulk of the mountains that hem the capital, and beyond, imagining toward the taller mountains, still those high Tibetan walls where the wind erases tracks between sunrise and noon. You think of the palace water clock again and wonder how time feels in Lhasa tonight, faster, slower, or simply sharpened to the present tense as it is here. Letters leave the capital before dawn, rolled tight with vermilion seals, orders to the Angsi Protectorate to stiffen its spine inquiries to allied tribes about horses, and grain instructions to frontier artisans to repair beacon towers along the Gansu corridor. A stable master yawns and cinches a girth, a courier swings into the saddle. You know this choreography policy becomes parchment. Parchment becomes hoofbeats. Hoofbeats become men standing on cold walls, staring west. A scholar you pass on the palace steps pauses to tell you something odd and old in early dynastic times. He says, soldiers at crisis moments tucked small slips of bamboo into their belts inscribed with charms against fear. He smiles thinly and admits he has written a few for his students, just ink and habit, but he likes to think courage can be carried like a word. You slip the image into your pocket. In anxious capitals, symbols work like stitches. They hold until stronger thread can be found. As morning kindles the tiled roofs, you sense the court settling on a posture, neither surrender nor reckless charge, but a coiled watchfulness. Troops will move, but not too far. Envoys will speak, but not too softly. There is talk of probing expeditions to test Tibetan lines, of sending rich gifts to distant oases to keep their loyalties bright, of reminding allies that Tang roads still lead somewhere worth traveling. Yet under the strategy, you feel the human question that no plan can quiet how long can order hold against a chill that rides in from the west. By noon, Chang'an appears ordinary again. Market bells ring, children chase each other past a stone drum that has survived more wars than anyone living remembers. But when the afternoon wind sniffs through the streets, people tug their sleeves tighter without thinking. You do it too, and you understand why the city's calm feels rehearsed. The defeat at Defechuan is more than a mark on a scroll. It is a draft under the door that will not stop. And so you keep walking through the capital's measured avenues, listening to the drum of hooves that may at any moment announce the next decision that will tilt the long table of the world either east or west. The wind whistles through a canyon where a caravan inches its way forward, laden with bolts of silk sacks of barley and bronze mirrors that glint like captured suns. You trail behind them, your boots crunching on gravel as the camels sway side to side. The trade routes between Tibet and Tang China are busy again, but each jingling harness and clinking bell carries a question: are these merchants here to trade or to spy? The Silk Road does not run in a straight line. Instead, it coils and bends around deserts, over ridges and through high passes where the air itself tests the lungs. You climb beside the traders, feeling the strain of altitude until you crest a ridge and see the valley spread below. Their tents of Tibetan patrols dot the slopes, while in the distance Chinese watchtowers rise against the pale sky. From up here, the whole frontier looks like a chessboard scattered with pawns, merchant soldiers, monks, each playing a role in the greater game. At a roadside camp, you sit near a fire as merchants murmur in multiple tongues: Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Persian. The air is alive with gossip. One man insists the Tang court has demanded higher tariffs on Tibetan goods. Another swears that among the rolls of silk are hidden maps smuggled west to guide Chinese armies. Historians still argue whether trade caravans in these years were primarily peaceful conduits of wealth or instruments of espionage. You listen, wrapped in the crackle of firewood, and realize both can be true. Curious tidbits cling to these stories. Some chronicles mention how the Tang introduced tea into Tibet, where it became mixed with yak butter and salt into the thick brew still drunk today. Others suggest that Tibetan horse herds became so valuable to Tang cavalry that entire campaigns revolved around controlling pastures. Whether exaggerated or not, you picture Tang officials carefully counting horse herds, measuring them as if they were coin. The nights along these roads are cold and endless. You lie awake, staring at stars sharp as needles, hearing only the shuffle of hooves and the distant howl of wolves. Merchants whisper of bandits, but their greater fear is of soldiers in disguise, swooping down not to rob but to seize information. The line between commerce and conflict is thinner than a sheet of parchment. Meanwhile, in Lhasa, Songtsen Gampo's court grows rich on this trade. Caravans pay tribute to pass through Tibetan valleys, and with every bolt of silk, every ingot of silver, the empire's coffers swell. Yet wealth attracts danger. Ministers argue in low voices whether to guard caravans more heavily or to let suspicion fall on Tang merchants themselves, using trade as bait for intelligence. In Chang'an, Tang officials record imports of musk wool and salt from Tibet. Yet behind the numbers lurk suspicions. Reports arrive that Tibetan traders linger too long at border markets, asking questions about garrisons and roads. Some urge the court to ban Tibetan caravans altogether, while others insist the wealth is too great to lose. You can almost hear the scratch of brushes on bamboo slips, writing policies that waver with each rumor. You travel with another caravan heading westward past shrines where mani stones are stacked in high cairns, each carved with prayers. At one shrine, a monk blesses the merchants, sprinkling barley grains on their packs. He warns them to guard not only their goods but also their tongues. Words, he says, travel faster than horses, and sometimes words can kill more surely than swords. His warning lingers with you long after the caravan moves on. Along the route, soldiers occasionally stop the trains. Some wave them through after inspecting bundles of cloth. Others slice open sacks, spilling barley into the dust, searching for hidden scrolls or weapons. One evening, a patrol finds an ivory box tucked among ordinary wares. Inside lies a set of letters in Chinese script, their seals broken. Were they stolen or planted? No one dares to guess aloud. Historians still debate how much these clandestine exchanges influenced the great wars between Tibet and Tang. Was it truly espionage or just the natural suspicion of rivals? Standing here, you can almost feel the weight of every suspicious glance, every hand lingering too long on a scroll. Trade here is not only about goods, it is about trust, and trust is always scarce at the edges of empire. As the caravan moves again, the road coils higher, the cold biting at your face. You walk with merchants and guards, each step crunching like ice breaking underfoot. Far below, you glimpse the roofs of a Tang border town, smoke curling peacefully from chimneys. Yet between you and them lie miles of suspicion secrets tucked into saddlebags and soldiers who may see every trader as a spy. The air is thin, the stakes higher, and the road feels endless. The air grows drier as you leave the high plateau and descend into the edge of Central Asia. Dust lifts with every step, coating your tongue with grit until you catch sight of a shimmering band of green on the horizon. This is an oasis town, one of many strung like beads across the desert that guards the arteries of the Silk Road. Yet as you approach, you see Tibetan banners fluttering above the walls, proof that the empire's reach has stretched far beyond the plateau. Tibetan forces have surged westward, drawn by the wealth and power that lie along these routes. You walk among their camps, where warriors tend horses and Polish weapons, their faces darkened by weeks of sun and sand. The men speak in low voices about victories at Kucha and Khotan towns, once under Tang influence, now swearing allegiance to Tibet. The empire that was once dismissed as a cluster of mountain tribes now controls gateways that feed the arteries of global trade. Inside the oasis, city life goes on, though under new masters. Markets bustle with merchants from Persia, Sogdiana, and India, their goods displayed beneath awnings that flap in the hot wind. But now Tibetan officials sit in judgment halls tallying tribute, and soldiers patrol the streets. You watch them pass, cloaks dust-streaked, yet eyes sharp, and you sense the unease of locals forced to navigate new rulers. Historians still argue whether Tibet's expansion into Central Asia was driven primarily by economic ambition or by the desire to outflank Tang China. Some say it was about controlling trade and taxation. Others suggest it was a strategic bid to surround Tang influence in the Tarim Basin. The debate remains unresolved, but as you walk beneath the palms of this oasis, you feel how both motives might be intertwined. Wealth and war often ride the same caravan. A curious tidbit surfaces in local stories. Tibetan generals were said to bring carved prayer stones into occupied cities, placing them at crossroads as protective talismans. Merchants claimed that rubbing the stones could bless their journeys, though others muttered that they were charms of domination. Fragments of such stones have been found centuries later, their carvings worn but still legible proof of Tibet's blend of faith and conquest. You wander through a caravanserai where travelers rest. A Persian merchant, sipping tea thick with dust, leans toward you and mutters that Tang envoys no longer command the respect they once did here. He gestures at the Tibetan guards lounging by the gate. These men, he whispers, now decide who profits and who starves. His words settle heavily in the air, and you realize that political maps are shifting in real time beneath your feet. Farther west, Tibetan armies push toward Gilgit, pressing into valleys that open onto the Indian subcontinent. The scale of the empire grows staggering from the snows of Lhasa to the deserts of Central Asia. Its banners ripple across thousands of miles. You stand at the edge of a riverbank watching troops ford the water, and it feels as if the entire land is caught in motion, an unstoppable tide rolling outward. Yet conquest brings tension. Supply lines stretch thin, and desert winds swallow caravans as easily as they do footprints. You overhear Tibetan officers worrying about whether captured towns will remain loyal or turn to Tang at the first opportunity. They station garrisons, build forts, and appoint governors, but suspicion never leaves their voices. Empire, you realize, is not just about taking territory, it is about holding it, and holding is always harder. In Chang'an, word of these advances strikes like thunder. Ministers argue whether the Tarim Basin can still be claimed, whether the Tang will lose the arteries of Silk Road wealth to their highland rivals. Some push for new campaigns, while others warn that rebellion at home makes distant wars reckless. The arguments echo in palace halls, while Tibetan horsemen drink from desert wells and carve their names into the sand. As night falls in the oasis, lamps flicker along narrow streets, their flames quivering in the desert wind. You walk alone beneath the stars, hearing snatches of languages mingling in the dark. Merchants still trade, monks still pray, children still chase each other through courtyards, but the shadow of Tibetan power looms over it all. The expansion has transformed the empire into a Central Asian power, its influence stretching farther than even Songtsen Gampo might have dreamed. You pause by the prayer stone at the crossroad, its carved mantra faint beneath your hand. The stone is cool despite the desert's heat, and you sense the weight of its message: this land is claimed for now by the empire on the roof of the world. Tomorrow, another caravan will pass, another garrison will arrive, another rumor will carry news eastward. But tonight, under the vast Central Asian sky, Tibet holds the road. The land to the east grows restless. You follow the dusty road back toward Tang territory, and along the way, you hear of a rebellion brewing. And Lushan, a trusted general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic heritage, has risen against the Tang court. The news spreads like wildfire, carried by merchants, monks, and soldiers alike, until it reaches even the high passes of Tibet. Suddenly the mighty Tang dynasty, whose armies once seemed endless, is distracted by civil war. In Chang'an, panic seizes the city. You walk through avenues once full of silks and laughter, now lined with closed shutters and fearful whispers. Officials flee, ministers vanish, and the imperial family abandons the capital itself. The Tang emperor flees westward, guarded by only a handful of loyal troops, while rebel forces march into the heart of China. The great city becomes a shadow of itself, its streets echoing with uncertainty. For Tibet, this chaos is opportunity. Envoys rush back to Lhasa with the news, their horses lathered and eyes bright. At court, advisors whisper in Songtsen Gampo's successor's ear, now is the moment. With Tang distracted, the western oases can be taken and the frontiers pushed deeper than ever. The Tibetan Empire, already pressing its advantage in Central Asia, sees the Tang's weakness as an open door. Historians still argue how deeply Tibet coordinated its campaigns with the An Lushan rebellion. Some suggest that Tibetan leaders actively exploited Tang's distraction, striking deliberately while China reeled. Others claim the overlap was coincidence, Tibet merely continuing its expansion. Whatever the case, you feel the momentum shift like a river suddenly freed of its dam, rushing forward with irresistible force. You march with Tibetan troops, moving into contested valleys, their hooves churning the earth. The soldiers laugh at Tang weakness, boasting that the empire, which once looked down on Tibet, now struggles to defend its own heartland. Along the way, you pass monasteries where monks pray for guidance. A curious detail catches your attention. In some temples, murals depict the upheaval in symbolic form. Dragons, twisting in turmoil, snow lions leaping through flames. Whether prophecy or commentary, the art mirrors the chaos of the age. Meanwhile, the rebellion tears China apart. You glimpse it through the eyes of refugees on the road, farmers clutching bundles of grain, scholars carrying scrolls strapped to their backs, families broken and scattered. One man tells you, his voice hoarse, that bandits now rule villages and once protected highways are deadly traps. His eyes gleam with both fear and disbelief, as though the collapse of Tang order has broken the natural rhythm of the world. Back in Tibet, the court grows bold. Armies march not only toward Central Asia, but also down into valleys closer to the Chinese heartland. Garrisons are seized, tribute collected, and border posts burn. You sense the thrill in the soldiers' voices, yet also the strain. Supplies stretched thin, loyalties tested, the vast distances of empire gnawing at cohesion. Still, with Tang in turmoil, even these difficulties cannot dim their ambition. Chang'an itself, once the symbol of Tang's strength, becomes a prize within reach. Some Tibetan commanders whisper of riding all the way to its gates, taking advantage of the rebellion to strike at the very core of the empire. You imagine them drawing maps by lamplight fingers, tracing routes across mountains and rivers, calculating how close they might dare to venture. Historians debate whether Tibet truly intended to conquer the Tang capital, or whether these were only raids meant to show power. The chronicles are unclear, each side exaggerating or minimizing as pride demands. Yet the thought lingers, Tibet, once the underdog, now had the chance to bring China to its knees. A more curious rumor drifts through the camps that Tibetan shamans performed rituals invoking the spirits of defeated Tang generals, binding them to fight for Tibet in the afterlife. Some soldiers swear they heard phantom drums in the night, distant yet rhythmic, as though the ghosts of enemies were marching alongside them. Whether superstition or imagination, it speaks to the deep intertwining of faith and war that colors every step of this conflict. As night falls over the frontier, you stand beneath a sky thick with stars, the air sharp and cold. In the distance, fires from Tibetan camps flicker their glow, spreading across the land like embers in dry grass. You know that the rebellion inside Tang has cracked open possibilities once unimaginable. The world feels unsteady, balanced on the edge of a knife, and you sense as the soldiers whisper and the banners ripple in the dark that the wars of the plateau are only beginning to enter their fiercest phase. You crest a ridge at dawn, and there below the plain trembles with the movement of thousands of hooves. The Tibetan army is on the march, banners snapping like fire in the wind, armor glinting in the pale light. The An-Lushan rebellion still tears Tang China apart, and the Tibetan commanders have chosen this moment to push farther east than ever before. You feel the weight of their ambition as the horizon opens to reveal the road toward Chang'an itself. Days of marching bring you down from the high passes into valleys thick with smoke. Tang garrisons undermanned and undersupplied fall quickly. Some towns surrender at the mere sight of Tibetan riders cresting their walls, their governors bowing rather than risk slaughter. Others resist briefly, arrows whistling from parapets, but their courage fades when the gates splinter beneath battering rams. The empire, once thought too remote to challenge China, now stands at the threshold of its capital. You join the soldiers as they approach the Wei River, a glittering ribbon cutting across the land like a defensive moat. Beyond it lies Chang'an, the jewel of the Tang dynasty, its walls towering, its streets once brimming with silks and spices. But rebellion has gutted the city, its defenses are weakened, its court scattered. For the first time you glimpse the possibility that Tibetan hooves might thunder through the Dragon Gate itself. Historians still argue about this episode. Some chronicles claim that Tibetan armies truly laid siege to Chang'an in 763, riding boldly to its walls, even briefly occupying the capital. Others suggest it was more of a show of force, a raid that panicked the Tang but fell short of full conquest. The records are contradictory, clouded by pride and humiliation. Standing here at the riverbank, you can imagine both versions, the city trembling under foreign banners, or the capital saved at the last moment by fortune. The soldiers around you mutter in awe. They have marched from the high roof of the world into the heart of China, a journey unimaginable only a generation ago. Some scoop up water from the Wei River in their helmets, drinking as though savoring proof of their victory. Others whisper nervously, glancing at the looming walls. Even in its weakened state, Chang'an is vast, its defences formidable. To strike at it is to tempt the wrath of a wounded giant. In the camps, shamans perform rituals, scattering barley flour into the air, calling upon mountain spirits to shield the army. A curious tidbit surfaces here. Some soldiers sew tiny bronze mirrors into their tunics, believing the mirrors will deflect enemy arrows. You watch as the firelight flickers on the polished discs, each reflecting a tiny, trembling flame. Whether superstition or comfort, it reveals the mingling of faith and fear on the eve of possible conquest. Inside the city, chaos reigns. Refugees pour through the gates, clutching what little they can carry, their stories painting a picture of terror. You hear of whole villages along the frontier emptied, their people driven before the advancing armies. Markets that once rang with laughter now echo with whispers of defeat. The great Tang capital, once the center of the civilized world, shivers in dread of riders from the mountains. Night falls and the Tibetan camp blazes with torches. Drums thunder in steady rhythm, echoing across the river, a sound meant as much to intimidate as to rally. You close your eyes and imagine the citizens of Chang'an hearing those drums in the distance, lying awake in fear, wondering if the dawn will bring foreign soldiers into their streets. Historians debate the outcome. Some say Tibetan banners indeed flew briefly within the capital. Others insist the city never fell. Yet even the possibility that it could happen speaks volumes. The empire of the plateau, once overlooked, had ridden to the gates of the greatest city of its age. That memory alone, whether truth or exaggeration, lingers like a scar on the Tang dynasty. As dawn breaks again, you feel the chill of the morning air. Mist curls from the river, half hiding the walls of Chang'an in a shroud of uncertainty. Whether the Tibetans pressed inside or turned back, the effect is the same the Tang dynasty has seen. Its heartland threatened, its invincibility shattered. And you, standing at the edge of the water, realize you are witnessing a moment when the world itself seems to tilt on its axis, if only for a heartbeat. The river mists fade, and with them the dream of conquest drifts into uneasy quiet. You walk through a camp where soldiers are rolling up banners, their laughter subdued, their eyes lingering on the distant walls of Chang'an, as though memorizing what they nearly claimed. For a fleeting moment, Tibet stood poised to strike the very heart of Tang power. Yet instead of storming forward, envoys ride out under flags of truce, their horses stepping cautiously as though the ground itself is fragile. A treaty is drafted, its words careful and polite, though you can almost hear the growl beneath the brushstrokes. Both sides claim victory in their own way. The Tang record it as the restoration of order, a moment when diplomacy preserved the dynasty's dignity. Tibetan chronicles speak of recognition of a Chinese court forced to acknowledge the strength of the plateau. The truth lies somewhere in between, balanced like a blade across the frontier. You sit in a dim tent where scribes scratch out the treaty lines by lamplight. Grain will be exchanged for horses, borders adjusted, tribute offered. A Tang envoy presents gifts of silk and porcelain. The Tibetan general answers with musk, salt, and wool. They smile, bow, and speak with practiced courtesy, but their eyes betray mistrust. You sense that both sides know the peace is a curtain thin and easily torn. Historians still argue whether this treaty was sincere or merely a pause to recover strength. Some say Tang leaders, weakened by rebellion, were desperate to buy time. Others believe Tibet had overreached and needed breathing room before pushing further. What is certain is that no one believed the words could hold forever. Even as the ink dries, raiders mount their horses again, slipping through passes to harass garrisons. A curious tidbit lingers in local memory villages along the frontier, would sometimes celebrate treaties with feasts, only to see raids resume within weeks. One tale tells of a farmer who buried his plough during negotiations, convinced war would make it useless again, only to dig it up the very next spring. The plough, worn smooth with years of this ritual, became a kind of charm, a reminder that peace was always provisional. You travel along the border as the treaty takes effect. Markets reopen, caravans move more freely, and the air feels lighter. Yet at night you hear the distant cry of horns from garrisons and know that armies still watch one another from across narrow valleys. In Lhasa, celebrations flare with butter lamps, but even as monks chant in temples, generals whisper of the next campaign. In Chang'an, officials proclaim stability, though behind their robes their hands tremble with the memory of how close the plateau's riders came. Walking through a frontier village, you see children playing with carved wooden horses, pretending to charge each other. Their laughter is bright, but their game echoes the real battles fought just beyond the hills. Their parents watch with weary smiles, knowing that another war could sweep through at any moment. This is life on the edge of empire treaties, signed in capitals, broken in valleys, and remembered in scars. Night deepens, and the treaty's promise feels as fragile as the paper it is written on. You sit by a fire, the crackle blending with the distant howl of wolves, and reflect on how empires speak of peace while sharpening their swords in silence. The Tibetans may have pulled back from Chang'an, but the desire to press eastward has not faded. For the Tang, survival means patience, rebuilding, and waiting for the moment when fortune shifts once again. As the embers glow, you realize that this treaty is not an ending, but an interlude. It is the pause between heartbeats, the breath before the next storm. And you, sitting in the flickering firelight, know that the war on the roof of the world is far from finished. You step through the western gates of Dunhuang, where desert sands give way to green fields watered by narrow streams. The oasis hums with life. Caravans jingle into courtyards, monks in saffron robes file toward temples, and the air smells of incense mixed with dust. Yet above all, your eyes are drawn to the cliffs where the Mogao caves burrow into stone. Inside, murals bloom like gardens on walls, their pigments still vibrant despite centuries of wind. Dunhuang is a place where art trade and empire collide, and now it finds itself caught between Tibet and Tang. The Tibetan banners hang over city towers, their bold colors startling against the pale desert backdrop. Garrison soldiers lounge near the gates, their laughter echoing down the lanes. Yet inside the monasteries, monks paint diligently, their brushes tracing outlines of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and celestial beings. You linger in one hall, watching as the light from butter lamps makes the painted figures shimmer as if alive. Even while wars sweep past the walls, capture visions of peace, historians still argue how much Tibet influenced Dunhuang's art during its occupation in the late 8th century. Some scholars point to the introduction of Tibetan motifs, snow lions and protective deities lurking at the edges of murals. Others claim the styles remained distinctly Chinese, with only faint traces of Tibetan presence. Standing here, you see both a blending of cultures, a dialogue between empires written in color and stone. A curious tidbit emerges from local tales. It is said that Tibetan officials, while stern in collecting taxes, sometimes commissioned murals themselves, asking monks to depict guardians that resembled their mountain gods. One story tells of a Tibetan general who insisted his likeness be painted as a wrathful deity, his mustache curling like flames. Whether true or apocryphal, the caves preserve a sense of how faith and power intertwined on this contested frontier. Beyond the monasteries, the town thrives uneasily. Merchants hawk silk spices and jade, their voices rising in dozens of tongues. Yet behind each transaction lies uncertainty. Will the next year's ruler demand different taxes? Will Tang armies return to reclaim the oasis? The people of Dunhuang learn to adapt, their loyalty shifting like sand depending on which banners fly above the walls. You walk through the bustling market, where Tibetan soldiers mingle with traders from as far as Persia. A seller of scrolls unrolls a manuscript filled with Buddhist sutras, the script neat and deliberate. He tells you it was copied by monks under Tibetan orders, part of a great effort to preserve sacred texts. You imagine scribes hunched in caves, scratching characters by lamplight, while soldiers outside prepare for battle. The juxtaposition is striking: swords and scripture's conquest and devotion. At night, the cliffs loom silent, the cave mouths dark as sleeping eyes. You enter one with a flickering lamp and see murals that shimmer with gold leaf. The figures seem to move in the shadows, bodhisattvas with serene expressions, demons twisted in torment. You realize these images are more than decoration. They are a form of resilience. Even as armies march and rulers change, the faith of the people continues to pour itself onto these walls. Some chronicles mention how, during Tibetan control, officials encouraged the building of fortifications around Dunhuang to secure its role as a hub. Others suggest that Tibet saw it less as a fortress and more as a jewel and oasis worth holding, not just for strategy, but for its cultural wealth. Historians still debate the true emphasis, but as you wander the lanes, you sense both impulses at work. You pause at a shrine where a monk chants softly, his voice echoing against stone. He tells you that the caves are like a mirror of the world king's rise and fall, but the Buddha's gaze endures. His words carry a calming weight, and you feel for a moment as though the dust of war cannot reach you here. Yet outside, the faint clang of soldiers' armor reminds you that empires still contest this desert jewel. As dawn creeps over the horizon, the murals glow faintly in the new light. You step back into the open air, the desert wind brushing against your face. Dunhuang stands as both fortress and sanctuary, a place where the memory of battles mixes with the timeless strokes of paint. And you know that while Tibet and Tang fight over it, the caves themselves will outlast them, whispering stories long after their banners fade. You follow the trade road farther west, where the Taklamakan Desert stretches like a sea of shifting gold. Sand dunes roll endlessly, crests sharp as blades in the sun, their shadows long and blue. The wind moans through the emptiness, and you realize why travelers call this the desert of death. Yet even here, caravans move steadily, their bells jingling their footsteps, tracing the lifeline that links east and west. At every crossroad, Tibet's influence now lingers, its garrisons watching from fortified oases. You arrive at one such oasis, the walls rough, but sturdy, their banners bearing the snow lion crest. Tibetan soldiers lounge by the gates, spears stacked neatly beside them. Within the walls, markets bustle with goods bolts of silk, Persian glassware, Kashmiri spices. You walk through the stalls, the air thick with the smell of cumin and incense, hearing half a dozen languages at once. The desert may seem empty, but here at its crossroads, the world gathers. Historians still argue how deeply Tibetan authority penetrated these distant oases. Some claim the empire ruled them tightly, appointing governors and enforcing taxes. Others suggest Tibet's grip was looser, relying on local elites, while simply collecting tribute. Standing in the dusty square, you see evidence of both Tibetan scribes tallying levies beside local merchants who continue their trade much as before. The empire's presence is visible, but its control feels negotiated, not absolute. A curious tidbit survives in local tales that Tibetan officers stationed here brought along portable shrines carved from wood, small enough to carry on horseback. Soldiers would set them up at crossroads, chanting prayers before resuming patrols. Some villagers swore the shrines glowed faintly at night, guiding caravans through the desert. Whether true or not, fragments of such shrines have been unearthed, charred by time, but still marked with carvings of guardians and flames. At night, you sit in a caravanserai courtyard. Camels groan, drivers laugh, and the desert wind brings the faint notes of a flute played by some soldier on watch. Merchants gossip under the stars, speaking of shifting loyalties. One town pledges allegiance to Tang, another to Tibet, another to whichever army arrives with the most force. The desert itself seems impartial, swallowing armies and caravans alike if they are careless. You march with a patrol sent out to secure the routes. The desert is merciless heat by day, cold by night, sandstorms that scour skin raw. Yet the soldiers endure their discipline, honed by years of war. They ride silently, scanning the horizon for raiders, their eyes narrowed against the glare. You realize that holding these crossroads is as much a test of endurance as of power. Back in Chang'an, officials fret over the same oases. Reports of Tibetan banners flying over Khotan and Kashgar trouble the court. Ministers warn that if the Tarim Basin is lost, so too is Tang influence over Central Asia. Others argue that the empire weakened by rebellion cannot afford to reclaim such distant lands. The debate continues in candlelit halls, but out here decisions are made by whoever controls the wells and caravan routes. In Lhasa, meanwhile, the victories feed ambition. Courtiers boast that Tibet now commands the Silk Road, its reach stretching farther than ever before. Yet whispers of unease creep into conversations. The desert is costly to hold. Soldiers grow weary, supplies falter. Empire, you sense, is always hungry, always demanding more than it can consume. As dawn rises over the Taklamakan, you watch caravans set out once again, their silhouettes small against the endless dunes. A trader waves to you before disappearing into the horizon, his goods bound for Persia, India, or perhaps even Rome's distant echoes. Overhead, the sky glows pink and gold, and for a moment the desert seems to soften its harshness, hidden beneath beauty. Still, you know the sands remember every step, every battle, every empire that dares to claim them, and Tibet's footsteps now join those of countless others etched briefly upon the shifting face of the desert. The river winds like a silver thread through the northern plains of China, wide and restless under storm-filled skies. You stand on its bank, the waters churning with spring floods, and hear the distant drum of hooves. Tibet's armies have come farther east than ever, pressing into the very heartland of the Tang dynasty, and here, along the Yellow River, their riders prepare to clash once more with imperial forces. The scene is tense. On one bank, Tibetan cavalry gathers their horses, stamping nervously at the river's roar. Banners ripple in the wind, painted with symbols of flame and snow lions. Across the water, Tang troops mass in disciplined ranks, their armor gleaming wet under the stormlight. Boats bob on the current, loaded with supplies, guarded by soldiers ready to ferry them across. Both sides know that to control the river is to control the heart of the frontier. Suddenly horns blare, and the battle begins. Tibetan riders charge into the shallows water, spraying up around their horses as they loose arrows mid-gallop. Tang boats push out from the far bank, rowers, straining soldiers braced with long spears. The clash is fierce cavalry versus rivercraft arrows against shields. The storm overhead breaks rain, pelting down thunder, rolling like war drums in the heavens. You crouch on the riverbank, soaked, feeling the tremor of hooves through the ground and the spray of the river against your face. Historians still argue about the scale of these battles. Some records describe Tibetans capturing entire towns along the Yellow River, pushing deep into the Chinese interior. Others claim these were raids bold but fleeting, meant to demonstrate strength rather than secure territory. The truth may lie between, yet the image of mountain riders clashing with river fleets endures, a symbol of how the war blurred the boundaries between worlds. A curious tidbit surfaces in chronicles. It is said that Tibetan shamans performed rituals by tossing barley into the river before battle, calling on its spirit to favor their crossing. Tang generals in turn offered silk banners to the river gods, praying for storms to sweep their enemies away. Two great powers, each invoking water as ally, turning the river into a battlefield, not just of men, but of spirits. The fighting rages for days. At night, the camps burn with torchlight, the rain steaming on wet armor, while soldiers patch wounds and whisper of omens. You walk among them, hearing fragments of conversation. One man swears he saw lightning strike only Tang boats, another insists it spared only Tibetans. Belief shapes courage, and in these wet, muddy fields, belief is as powerful as steel. Eventually, the armies pull back, neither able to hold the river fully. Tang troops withdraw to fortresses, their walls lit with beacons, while Tibetan riders melt back into the hills, their hooves leaving only churned mud in their wake. The Yellow River flows on indifferent, carrying the memory of blood and thunder into the sea. In Chang'an, news of the clashes deepens unease. Officials argue in dim halls, some insisting the heartland is secure, others warning that the empire has never been so vulnerable. The emperor listens silent while rain taps against palace tiles like the echo of distant arrows. Meanwhile in Lhasa the victories are celebrated with feasts, yet generals whisper among themselves that holding the river would require more than raids. It would demand an empire's full weight. You return to the riverbank after the armies depart. The waters run brown with silt swollen from rain, but already the traces of battle are fading. A broken spear floats downstream, turning slowly in the current, carried toward horizons unknown. You breathe in the damp air and realize that rivers remember differently from men, not in chronicles or songs, but in the silt they carry, in the scars on their banks, in the echoes of hoofbeats and oar strokes swallowed by endless flow. As the clouds part, the moon emerges, silver light rippling across the restless water. The war along the Yellow River has left no clear victor, yet it has etched itself into the memory of both empires. You step away from the bank, knowing the river will remain long after kings and generals are forgotten, its currents whispering of battles fought and ambitions drowned. The battlefield quiet fades into the hush of polished floors and silk curtains. You are no longer among rivers and horses, but inside the palaces of two great courts, where words become weapons sharper than steel. Envoys travel between Chang'an and Lhasa, their journeys measured not just in miles, but in the weight of secrets they carry. Tonight you walk beside one such envoy, his lacquered chest heavy with gifts, jade seals, carved mirrors, bolts of silk, all symbols of friendship that may conceal barbs beneath their shine. At the Tang court, audiences are a ritual of balance. The envoy kneels, presents his treasures, and speaks in carefully measured tones. Ministers smile, their robes swishing like restless waves, yet their eyes flicker, gauging intent. Are these gifts true offerings of peace or the honeyed prelude to threats? The hall glitters with gold and bronze, but beneath the light suspicion thickens like incense smoke. Historians still argue whether such embassies were sincere attempts at stability or thinly veiled traps to lull the other side. In Lhasa, the script plays out differently, but with equal tension. Tibetan courtiers sit on high-backed seats, their cloaks heavy with fur, their expressions unreadable. They accept silks and porcelain from Tang envoys, then return with musk turquoise and promises. The words are warm, but the glances are sharp. You can feel it as you stand in the hall. Alliances here are made not with clasped hands, but with hidden daggers. A curious tidbit surfaces in Tibetan chronicles. It is said that one Tang envoy, upon departing, left behind a porcelain vase that shattered mysteriously during the night. Monks interpreted it as an omen that the alliance would break, and indeed, within months, raids resumed along the frontier. Whether the tale is true or embroidered, it reveals how even the smallest accident could ripple into prophecy when mistrust was already deep. You follow the envoys into the more private spaces of their missions banquets, lit by butter lamps, tea poured into jade cups, laughter that sounds too rehearsed. Soldiers stand nearby, their hands resting on hilts, watching every smile. In these moments, peace feels like a stage play, actors reciting lines while backstage armies prepare. Back in Chang'an, rumors swirl through the markets. Some whisper that Tibetan gifts are cursed, others that Tang envoys return with maps hidden in the seams of their robes. In taverns, storytellers recite tales of spies slipping through mountain passes disguised as traders. Truth and rumor weave together until no one can tell them apart. Meanwhile, in Lhasa's narrow streets, gossip mirrors the same. People murmur that Tang officials speak one way to the king and another to the generals, sowing discord deliberately. Others insist that the Tang are desperate, sending fine gifts to cover their weakness. You pause to listen to an old man who claims he once saw a Tang envoy carry a box so heavy it took 3 men to lift. He swears it was filled with gold meant to bribe Tibetan ministers. Perhaps it was, or perhaps his tale has grown with each retelling. Historians debate one particularly shadowed episode whether Tibet once invited Tang officials into negotiations only to hold them hostage until a favorable treaty was signed. Some records hint at it, though others deny it entirely. The truth remains uncertain, but the story itself reflects the atmosphere. Every embassy a gamble, every envoy aware that one misstep might mean imprisonment or worse. At night the palaces fall quiet, but the tension lingers. You wander the courtyards, lantern light trembling on stone, and think of how fragile these alliances are. A spilled drink, a mistranslated phrase, a broken vase, any of these could unravel what treaties cannot hold. Yet still the process repeats. Envoys ride, gifts are exchanged, and words of peace are spoken while armies sharpen blades in the background. The hidden daggers remain sheathed for now, but their presence shapes every gesture. You leave the palace with that image in your mind, smiles concealing suspicion, treaties trembling like glass. The wars of empires are not only fought on rivers and plains, they are fought across low tables in whispered conversations and in the silence between words. The thunder of hoofbeats has faded into echoes, and you now walk among hills where spring grass pushes up through old scars of war. The tide of fortune is beginning to turn, and you can feel it in the air, lighter in some places, heavier in others. The Tang dynasty, shaken but not broken, begins to gather its strength again, while the Tibetan Empire feels the first tremors of overreach. In Chang'an, ministers meet late into the night, candle flames guttering as they draft new strategies. Generals hardened by years of rebellion and raids return to court, with confidence insisting that the empire can no longer simply endure Tibetan pressure, it must push back. One name surfaces again and again, Guozi the Tang general, whose calm leadership and shrewd tactics earn him legendary status. His campaigns bring new order to regions once thought lost, and you sense the court spirits rise with each report of regained ground. On the plateau, the mood is different. You walk through a Tibetan camp near the frontier where soldiers speak in hushed tones. Victories have carried them far, but supply lines stretch thin, and the mountains do not forgive neglect. Some officers warn that raids into the Yellow River Valley risk exhaustion. Others argue the momentum must not be lost. The debates grow heated, echoing the deeper tension: how far can empire stretch before it begins to tear? Historians still argue whether Tibet's setbacks came more from Tang resurgence or from its own internal strains. Some chronicles emphasize Guozi's brilliance, while others note famine, plague, and rebellion simmering within Tibet itself. Standing among the camps, you see both forces at work, the enemy growing stronger, while the empire itself begins to stumble. A curious tidbit reaches your ears from a frontier village. Locals tell of Tibetan soldiers leaving small clay figurines at crossroads before retreating, tokens meant to guard the land until they returned. Some villagers kept the figurines believing they carried blessings, while others smashed them fearing they bound the land to foreign rule. Even in these simple objects you glimpse the tug-of-war between presence and absence, loyalty and resentment. You follow the Tang counterattacks as they sweep westward. Fortresses once under Tibetan banners are reclaimed, their walls patched hastily with new timbers. Smoke rises from beacon towers, signaling victories to towns farther down the valleys. You stand on one such wall, watching soldiers cheer as Tang banners climb the battlements again, and feel the surge of relief proof that the dynasty is no longer crumbling. In Lhasa court, politics grow strained. Monks chant in the temples calling for divine favor, while ministers quarrel over strategy. Some push for renewed offensives, others urge consolidation. You sense the shadow of doubt creeping into the halls where confidence once rang. The empire that stretched so boldly into Central Asia now must decide whether to hold or to retreat. And yet the wars are not over. Raids continue, towns change hands, treaties are signed and broken. The frontier remains a shifting line, drawn and redrawn in blood and dust. You travel with a Tang garrison reclaiming a valley fortress, only to learn that Tibetans seized another town a few miles away. The war is no longer one-sided, it is a pendulum swinging back and forth with every season. At night, you stand on a ridge looking east to the glowing lights of Tang towns and west to the dark outline of Tibetan passes. Between them lies the contested heartland scarred by years of struggle. You breathe in the cool night air, heavy with the smell of campfires, and realize that this turning of the tide is not a sudden reversal, but a slow shift, like a river carving a new course over time. The war has entered a new phase. No longer a story of Tibetan advance alone, it is now a contest of endurance, one empire rising against the other, grappling with the limits of ambition. And you caught in the stillness of the frontier, night can almost hear the world balancing itself, poised between past victories and uncertain futures. You follow the windswept steppe northward, where grasslands stretch in endless waves and the horizon seems to have no edge. Here, alliances are born not in marble halls, but in the shifting camps of nomadic confederations. For decades, Tibet has relied on the Uyghurs, those skilled horsemen of the steppes, as both buffer and ally. Yet as you ride through their encampments, the smell of roasting mutton thick in the air, you sense change. The tents are still bright with painted designs, the herds still vast, but loyalties no longer shine as clearly as banners in the sun. Uyghur chieftains meet Tibetan envoys in smoky felt tents, cups of fermented mare's milk passed between them. Their words are polite, but behind the courtesies lies calculation. The Uyghurs know that Tibet's power is not limitless. They have seen supply lines strain and rebellion simmer in the mountains. More tempting still, the Tang court, desperate to rebuild its strength, now whispers of alliances offering gifts and promises of prestige. You realize that for the Uyghurs, loyalty is less a matter of blood than of opportunity. Historians still argue about the precise moment when Uyghur support tilted away from Tibet and toward Tang China. Some chronicles insist it was a gradual drift, others suggest a decisive betrayal at a single battle. Either way, the outcome is clear. Tibet begins to lose one of its most valuable allies. You feel the shift, like a sudden wind change, invisible yet undeniable. A curious tidbit surfaces from Uyghur lore. In some songs preserved by their descendants, Tibetans are described not as foes, but as brothers of the mountains, once respected, later distrusted. These verses speak of horse trades, feasts under the stars, and then of anger when promises were broken. Whether entirely accurate or romanticized, the songs carry the memory of an alliance turned sour, recorded not in scrolls, but in melody. You wander through a Uyghur camp at dusk, the fires glowing against the open sky. Children chase each other among the herds, while warriors polish saddles and sharpen blades. Yet the stories you hear now are of Tang emissaries offering silk and marriages of opportunities too rich to ignore. A young warrior leans close and whispers that Tibet is strong, yes, but the Tang are steady, and steady often outlasts strong. His words echo in your mind as the night grows colder. Meanwhile, in Lhasa, the court feels the loss keenly. Ministers mutter that the Uyghurs cannot be trusted, that their shifting allegiances are as unpredictable as the winds. Some urge new campaigns to secure loyalty by force. Others caution that Tibet's armies are already stretched thin. The empire, once confident in its alliances, now feels isolated on the plateau. In Chang'an, by contrast, relief spreads. The Tang court, weary from rebellions and raids, embraces Uyghur aid. Uyghur cavalry ride proudly into the capital, their horses draped in rich cloth, their leaders honored with feasts. You watch from the shadows of the great city as banners of Tang and Uyghur fly side by side, a new partnership forming in plain sight. The effect is immediate on the battlefield. Tibetan raids that once met little resistance now face fresh Uyghur horsemen, skilled in the same swift maneuvers that Tibet had used so effectively. The clashes grow fiercer, victories fewer. You travel with a Tibetan patrol that narrowly escapes an ambush, the shouts of Uyghur riders echoing in the night. The shock in the soldiers' voices is unmistakable. An old ally now turns his bow against them. As winter settles over the steppes, you sit by a lonely fire, listening to the howling wind. The grassland seems endless, its emptiness filled with the ghosts of broken alliances. The Uyghurs have shifted their weight, and Tibet, once bolstered by their friendship, now stands more vulnerable than ever. The turning tide you felt before now gathers speed, pulling the empire on the roof of the world into a harsher current. You return to Lhasa, the beating heart of the empire, where the air is thinner but heavy with incense smoke. The city thrums with life monks chanting in great temples, merchants shouting prices in crowded markets, soldiers clattering through narrow lanes with their armor dusted white from mountain roads. On the surface, it seems as though the capital thrives, a hub where conquest, wealth, and faith intertwine. Yet as you walk deeper into its streets, you sense shadows growing within. The Patala Hill rises before you, crowned with palaces and halls where kings and ministers meet. Inside, voices clash more often than swords. Generals argue over dwindling supplies, monks debate the morality of endless campaigns, and ministers whisper about famine in distant provinces. You stand near a carved pillar, watching the debates swirl like smoke, and realize that the empire's greatest enemy may no longer be Tang China, but its own divisions. Historians still argue whether internal strife or foreign pressure truly broke the Tibetan Empire. Some emphasize Tang counterattacks, others point to power struggles after the deaths of strong kings. Both threads are visible here in Lhasa, the pressure from outside and the unraveling within. The once unified energy that carried Tibet into Central Asia now splinters into suspicion. In the markets, you hear rumors of shortages. Barley, the lifeblood of Tibetan diet, grows scarcer, prices climbing until ordinary families struggle to eat. Traders grumble that caravans no longer flow, as freely cut off by wars and shifting alliances. A woman selling woolen cloaks tells you her sons have been conscripted, leaving her to keep the stall alone. Her voice trembles, though she straightens her back with pride. The cost of empire is etched in the lives of ordinary people. A curious tidbit lingers in these streets. Local law claims that some courtiers carried tiny reliquaries on their belts, silver boxes filled with grains of sacred barley to ward off famine and misfortune. You see one in a jeweler's stall, its carvings faded, but the idea remains poignant. Even the elite clung to charms as fear of scarcity grew. Faith and desperation braided tightly together, worn like amulets against decline. You pass through Jokang Temple, where butter lamps flicker before the revered statue of Jowo Shakyamuni. Pilgrims prostrate themselves in long rows, their foreheads touching the worn stones. Their devotion is steady, yet their prayers now carry an edge of worry. Monks chant louder, filling the air with syllables meant to steady a kingdom trembling under invisible weight. The sound rolls through the temple like waves, but outside the rumble of unrest cannot be hushed so easily. In the royal court, whispers of intrigue multiply. Rival factions form around ambitious generals, each imagining themselves as savior of the empire. Ministers accuse one another of betraying the people, of favoring Tang envoys, of hoarding supplies. You stand at the edge of one heated exchange, voices, sharp hands twitching at sword hilts. It feels as though the unity once forged by Songtsen Gampo is cracking piece by piece. Beyond the palace walls, discontent stirs. Farmers grumble at new levies, soldiers mutter about endless marches, and even some monks question the empire's path. Though Tibet still holds great swathes of land, the unity that carried it across deserts and rivers frays here in its capital. The snow lion roars less like a single beast and more like many voices clashing at once. Night falls and you climb a hill overlooking Lhasa. The city glimmers with torchlight, its roofs glowing faintly against the dark mountains. It looks serene from afar, yet you know the harmony is fragile. Inside those glowing halls, ambition breeds rivals. Outside, hunger gnaws at the people. The empire may still command armies and treasures, but within shadows lengthen. You exhale, watching the cold breath hang in the air, and feel the uneasy truth, even on the roof of the world, power is never beyond fracture. Section 20. The seasons turn and you feel the empire slipping. Once Tibetan banners swept boldly across Central Asia rivers and valleys. Now the winds carry news of faltering kings and ambitious generals who carve the empire into pieces for themselves. You stand in a hall once filled with the roar of victory chants, but the air is quieter now, filled instead with murmurs of distrust. The snow lion is no longer roaring, it is beginning to splinter into claws. In the royal palace, succession disputes rise like storms. Kings who once commanded vast armies pass away, leaving behind fragile heirs too young or too weak to hold the throne. Regents grasp at power, ministers form factions, and generals wait for their chance to seize command. You listen from a shadowed corner as one minister accuses another of collusion with Tang envoys, while a general insists the frontier must be abandoned to focus on the capital. Voices clash louder than the wind outside, but no unity emerges. Historians still argue whether the Tibetan Empire's decline was inevitable or accelerated by poor leadership. Some claim the sheer size of the empire made cohesion impossible. Others point to specific rulers whose indecision left the realm vulnerable. The debate lingers, but here, walking among these halls, you see the cracks forming in real time. It is not just armies at the border that weaken Tibet, but the hunger for power within. A curious tidbit surfaces in stories of this era. Some generals returning from campaigns were said to carry their own portable thrones, setting them up in captured towns as if already kings. Whether true or exaggerated, it reveals the growing arrogance and ambition of commanders who no longer saw loyalty to Lhasa as unshakable. Empire, once a shared vision, becomes a patchwork of personal fiefdoms. Meanwhile, famine stalks the land. You walk through villages where barley harvests have failed, where families boil thin stews and whisper prayers for rain. Soldiers pass through demanding supplies for their campaigns, and the people bow with hollow eyes. In some regions, resentment sparks into open unrest, peasants resisting levies, monks leading protests against corruption. The empire that once seemed unstoppable now groans under its own weight. You travel along the frontier and find garrisons undermanned, their walls crumbling, their captains unsure whether reinforcements will ever come. Soldiers sit listlessly by fires, their armor patched and their spirits low. They tell you Tang raids have returned, striking boldly into valleys once firmly under Tibetan control. Without strong leadership, the garrisons fight piecemeal victories, scarce defeats multiplying. In Chang'an, Tang officials watch the unraveling with cautious satisfaction. They record in their chronicles how the plateau's unity falters, though they know better than to underestimate their rival completely. Tang armies begin pressing west again, reclaiming some lost oases, bolstered by alliances with Uyghurs and others who no longer fear Tibet. You can almost hear the relief in their scrolls. The storm from the plateau is breaking. Back in Lhasa, monasteries remain filled with chanting, but even here, the mood is tense. Some monks argue that the empire's decline is punishment for straying too far into worldly conquest. Others claim it is simply the wheel of karma turning empires rising and falling, as all things do. Their voices mingle with the chants, filling the air with both resignation and defiance. At night, you wander the streets of Lhasa. The city still glimmers with butter lamps. Merchants still bargain over wool, and salt pilgrims still prostrate themselves before the great temples. Yet beneath the surface uncertainty pulses. Families whisper about which general might seize the throne next, about whether the empire can endure another decade. The once solid sense of destiny has thinned into questions. You climb again to a high ridge looking out over the capital. The mountains loom eternal and unmoved, while the city glows faintly at their feet. You realize the contrast. The land itself is unyielding, but the empire built upon it is fragile, subject to hunger, pride, and ambition. As the wind sweeps across the plateau, it seems to carry away the echoes of old victories, leaving only silence where once the roar of conquest rang. The wars grow quieter now, not because they cease, but because memory begins to wrap them in different colors. You walk through a library in Chang'an where Tang scholars bend over bamboo slips recording the empire's triumphs and sorrows. Ink stains their fingers, the smell of pine soot thick in the air. Here Tibet appears as a shadow, an invader, a restless neighbor, a threat that crept too close to the dragon throne. The chronicles shape the story to remind future generations of Tang endurance even in times of turmoil. Travel farther west and you find a monastery tucked into a valley where monks copy scrolls by lamplight. These are Tibetan hands writing Tibetan memory, and their story flows differently. Here Tibet stands not as an invader but as a sovereign power, bold enough to ride to the gates of Chang'an. The victories are sung like prayers woven into epics, where kings and generals gleam as heroes. You sit in the glow of the butter lamps, hearing the scratch of brushes and the quiet chant of verses, and you sense how two empires carved clashing truths into history. Historians still argue how much of either account can be trusted. Tang records often minimize Tibetan successes, glossing over defeats, while Tibetan sources exaggerate triumphs and brush aside failures. Both carry pride as heavy as armor. Between them lies a fog through which modern scholars still try to glimpse what truly happened. You feel the tension in those gaps where history becomes less about facts and more about stories shaped by the needs of empire. A curious tidbit lingers in folklore. In some Tibetan villages, elders told children that when the horsemen rode to Chang'an, the stars themselves moved to watch, pausing in their courses as if curious about mortals daring such feats. In Chinese tales, meanwhile, ghosts of the dead from border battles were said to haunt mountain passes. Their cries carried on the wind. Myths sprouted in both lands, shading memory with wonder and dread alike. You wander through Dunhuang again, where murals painted during the Tibetan occupation still glow faintly. A Tang pilgrim passing centuries later scrawled a note in the margin of one manuscript. The Tibetans once ruled here, but the Buddha remained. It is a simple line, yet it captures how ordinary people saw these struggles as waves of rulers rising and falling, while their faith endured like the desert cliffs. In Lhasa, storytellers gather in smoky halls, their voices low and rhythmic as they recount the deeds of emperors. Children lean close eyes wide as they hear how Tibet once matched the might of China blow for blow. The stories are embroidered with miracles, with kings riding under divine banners, with rivers parting for Tibetan armies. The truth may be blurred, but the pride is clear memory, becomes a shield even when empire itself has begun to fade. You step outside into the night. The stars above shine indifferent, yet you feel how both Tibet and Tang looked up at them and saw signs of destiny. The chronicles, the epics, the folklore, all are attempts to fix fleeting victories into eternity, but the wind across the plateau whispers, otherwise empires pass, memories shift, and only the mountains remain unchanged. As you walk on, you realize you are moving not just through lands, but through layers of remembrance. Wars end, but their stories echo, reshaped by every tongue that tells them. And you, caught between the voices of Tang scribes and Tibetan monks, begin to understand that history itself is a battlefield, one that never truly falls silent. The wind is sharp as you climb the last ridge, your breath thin in the high air. Below you stretches the plateau, vast and silent, the mountains rising like frozen waves around you. The Tibetan Empire has grown, triumphed, faltered, and now it begins to dissolve into memory. You pause here at the edge of its story and listen to the stillness, the kind of silence that carries echoes of all that has passed. The armies are gone, but the land remembers. You imagine hoofprints pressed deep into the soil, now softened by moss. Broken spearheads lie buried under centuries of dust. Monasteries stand where fortresses once bristled, their chanting filling the valleys where trumpets once blared. You walk through one such monastery, its whitewashed walls gleaming against the sky, and hear the low drone of voices rising together in prayer. The wars against Tang China are not forgotten, but they are transformed, folded into chronicles, retold in stories, softened by the rhythm of devotion. Historians still argue whether Tibet's fall was swift or gradual. Some say the empire fractured like ice under sudden thaw, collapsing as generals carved fiefdoms from the core. Others describe a slower, fading one defeat and famine at a time, until the vast empire dwindled back to the high valleys from which it came. Yet the debate matters less than the truth you feel here. Decline is never one moment, but a long sigh, a loosening grip. A curious tidbit lingers in Tibetan legend. It is said that when the empire finally weakened, sacred birds circled above Lhasa, crying mournfully, their wings black against the snow-bright sky. People whispered they were spirits of the old kings, reluctant to leave their land. Whether myth or memory, the image endures, tying the fall of empire to the eternal rhythm of the natural world. You walk onward past cairns of prayer stones stacked high by pilgrims, each carved with mantras. The wind whistles through them like a hymn, carrying the prayers across valleys and ridges. The stones stand as quiet witnesses to the centuries' reminders that while empires rise and fall, the devotion of ordinary people weaves continuity through the breaks of history. The Tang dynasty, too, fades in time, its chronicles weathered by the same centuries that softened Tibetan epics. Yet the wars between them left marks on both sides in the defences built, along frontiers, in the murals painted in Dunhuang, in the songs and scrolls that preserved memory. You realize that history itself is stitched from these remnants, fragments of pride and sorrow woven into one cloth. As night falls, you sit at the edge of a cliff, stars glowing above as they did when the first Tibetan riders looked eastward with ambition. The plateau breathes around you, cold, vast, eternal. You feel the weight of what was lost, but also the peace of what remains: mountains, rivers, wind and sky. The empire is gone, but its echoes linger whispering through prayer flags that flutter ceaselessly in the high air. The story slows now like a river easing into a wide, calm lake. You lean back against the rock, letting the night surround you. The stars scatter across the sky like silver dust, and the wind, once sharp, softens into a steady sigh. The weight of armies, of treaties, of shifting banners slips away, leaving only quiet. You breathe deeper, your chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the land itself. The mountains that bore witness to the rise and fall of empires still stand unchanged, their peaks pale in the moonlight. Their stillness reassures you. No matter how loud men shout or how fiercely kingdoms clash, the earth remains, enduring patiently. You let that truth settle into you, a reminder that your own worries, like empires, will fade with time. Imagine the prayer flags you saw along the ridges, their colors fading in the sun, but their whispers never ending. Each flap in the breeze carries a blessing outward, across valleys, across oceans, across years. You can almost hear them now, mingling with the breath of the night, steady, soothing, eternal. Their voices remind you that peace is not absence, but presence, the presence of calm within yourself, even when storms roar outside. Your eyelids grow heavy as the world quiets. The stories of Tibetan Tang drift like smoke, dissolving into the greater stillness. The drums, the hooves, the cries of warriors all fade into whispers carried far away. What remains is the hush of the high plateau, the gentle cradle of mountains, the soft glow of starlight above. You let yourself drift with it, floating gently into rest, knowing you are safe, knowing you are held by the silence of the world. Sweet dreams.